Hi, everybody. My name is John Stys, and I'm speaking to you today from Chicago, Illinois, where I am a part-time assistant professor at Loyola University Chicago in the Parkinson School of Health Sciences and Public Health. So I'm thrilled to be able to share some of my thoughts with you today. So just a slide. So who is this guy? Uh, I am a bioethicist, trained initially as a registered nurse, and then spent a good chunk of my career in healthcare quality and also in clinical operations, both in federally qualified health centers, um, providing primary care services, and then also in hospice and palliative care agencies in the Chicagoland region and across the United States. Um, I studied healthcare quality at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and my bioethics work is from Loyola University Chicago, both a master's degree and a doctoral degree. Um, and I mentioned that I've been teaching at Loyola, teaching ethics either in the philosophy department or School of Nursing, and now the School of Public Health, on and off for about the last 18 years as an adjunct or assistant professor. So what I'd really like to talk about today, is this idea that we're getting much closer to long duration human spaceflight becoming a reality, becoming something more than just science fiction, of course. Of course, with all of the recent action with SpaceX and Blue Origin and others, we see a lot of excitement building around really additional, different groups of people having access to spaceflight. Now, this is, of course, not long duration by any means yet. Some of it's really just even minutes long. But I think, this is all very much on the horizon, and we can, I think, expect to see, a mission to, back to the moon or to Mars, within our lifetimes. And, as a bioethicist, I think a lot about healthcare, obviously. And I've started to wonder, as others have, about how we will treat each other in the context of providing medical care to each other on these longer duration missions. And so, really, that my premise for today is quite simple, and that is that we just need to start talking about it, right? Because ultimately, this will become an issue. These are hard decisions to make on a good day on Earth, with all the resources at one's fingertips. But the situation, the scenarios in space, in a very small, confined spacecraft, and cooped up like that for weeks or months, just makes everything, as we know, much more difficult. And so, my premise here is that, how we start to think about this, and ultimately the decisions that we make about how we want to treat each other on these longer exploratory missions, I think says a lot about who we are as a society, and ultimately will dictate our success. I think, longer term as a spacefaring society. So what I'd like to suggest in terms of a few learning objectives are really just three simple things. I'm going to provide a quick sort of case scenario, and from that, identifying three potential courses of action in this hypothetical scenario where a crew member becomes incapacitated, um, identify and apply some of the ethical principles at play, and then talk a little bit about, in terms of ethical theory, what kind of approach might work better than another, or at least what are the ramifications of examining any kind of ethical dilemma from one point of view or another. Um, so my research question here, I'll read it. So in cases where illness or injury renders an astronaut or a crew member in need of long-term life support and bedside medical care during a lengthy mission, is it acceptable or even inevitable to consider euthanasia to preserve the human and material resources necessary for an overall positive mission outcome? And by lengthy here, I'm considering a lengthy mission at this point, something that lasts really, multiple weeks, as short as multiple weeks to months, and years is probably a little aggressive at this time, but ultimately that will become a question as well. Um, in some of my, you know, background research on this subject, one of the things that jumped out to me is that, in fact, very few people have died in space. Certainly the toll, of humans perishing in the line of duty, so to speak, is much greater than a few people, of course. Um, but according to some, if you take the Kármán line as sort of the accepted boundary of space, it looks like about 3 documented cases of astronaut death have occurred. And I think for the amount of experimentation and exploration that humans have done, that's actually quite small, but certainly not insignificant. And as we consider or reconsider future travel to the moon and Mars and who knows where else, I think it's reasonable, if we're thinking about survivability and thinking about the healthcare that we might have to provide to one another on that kind of a mission. It's reasonable to predict that there will be additional casualties and likely deaths amongst spacefaring crews. Another point about bioethics in space, right? I mean, there has certainly been you know space ethics and astroethics are a couple of the terms. This is not necessarily a new idea, right? About how do we treat each other in space. But the issues on a whole tend to be a little more macro in scope than how do we resolve a specific healthcare related issue. These are really sort of planetary scale issues about planetary protection or contaminating environments on other planets or moons, et cetera. And a quote that stood out, and this is one man, in one conversation 6 years ago, but astronaut Mike Massimino said in a radio podcast, radio podcast, Star Talk, about death in space. He said, it could happen, quote, but of all the training I've had, we never went over that one, unquote. And so, my guess is he was being a little glib on that one. I'm sure much more discussion has gone into it actually than what he has said there. But I think the point he's trying to make ultimately is that he's probably in agreement that there needs to be a little bit more conversation about these issues. So one of the other interests that I have personally, is narrative ethics. The whole idea of using stories, whether it's film or television, or a simple personal narrative, um, to demonstrate uh, or teach about ethics or bioethics specifically. And we have no shortage of ethical narratives that take place in space, right? So I'll skip over Star Trek of course, for the moment. Just about every other episode in any one of the Star Trek series has something to do with ethics, I think. Um, but there's a film out right now that I think is particularly interesting, and it's called Stowaway. It was released this year. It stars Anna Kendrick and others, Daniel Day Kim, and it's a very fascinating film, and I won't give away the ending. Um, but the idea here, but the plot is very similar ultimately to the scenario that I'll pose here in a minute. Is that there's a three-person crew headed to Mars, and unbeknownst to them, just hours after launch, they reach orbit and they realize that they have a stowaway on board. And this is not a film about somebody who snuck on board and is trying to sabotage a mission or something like that. It's a launch support engineer who, they don't go into it in much detail in the film, but um, an engineer basically falls into um, a spot, between two components in the spacecraft, sort of gets stuck there, becomes unconscious, during launch. Is found later on upon reaching orbit, and he's just as surprised as anybody else to find himself on board the spacecraft, right? Um, but obvious questions um, come from this scenario, right? And ultimately, the question around in this film has to do with the resources available on board, and in this case, it's really about the CO2 scrubbing capabilities that the spacecraft has. And with four people on board instead of three, they realize that they will not arrive, arrive in Mars to Mars alive. Basically, they will have run out of oxygen, um, and so they have to start thinking about some decisions. If we want this mission to be a success, how, what steps do we need to take, and how far are we willing to go to make this mission a success? And the equation is we can't have four people go to Mars. There's got to be three people or fewer. And so, the math there becomes very interesting. And so in a film even like that, you see that there are issues around assisted suicide, the professional duty of physicians, and Anna Kendrick plays the physician on this crew. And so the duty of physicians to advocate for their patients. And then ultimately, the relative value and worth of different people aboard this spacecraft. Our crew inherently more important, more valuable than the stowaway, right? In this example, this passenger. And you have this sort of lifeboat scenario, right? Very classic. You've got limited number of resources. How do you decide who lives, who dies? And so, again, my research question here is ultimately about euthanasia, um, and whether or not, in a case where, a crew member is injured or incapacitated to such a degree that requires, 24-hour care, is it ever acceptable or likely inevitable um, to consider euthanasia, right? To basically, in a caring and gentle, yet obviously purposeful way to kill this crew member in order to preserve and even save the rest of the crew. Ultimately, the math being, some balance of human resources, the time and the effort necessary to, maintain and fly the spacecraft to wherever the mission is going, or potentially running out of some kind of material resources, whether that's medical supplies or say oxygen, like in the stowaway film. And I have a hypothetical scenario here that I've sort of already gone over a couple times here, but um, I think it bears repeating. So assume that for a minute that you are one of three astronauts aboard a spacecraft, and you're about halfway to Mars, and one of your two crewmates, while doing some task on the spacecraft, is electrocuted, and you don't find this crew member, until, you don't find this person immediately after this accident, but you find her unconscious. She's been deprived of oxygen for some period of time, but is still alive. And I think it's fair to say that, any group of dedicated people who care for one another, like in a small crew, in any scenario, the two healthy colleagues, crew members, would care for that person around the clock. I don't think there's really any doubt about that. They're going to care and hope to cure, right? But in this scenario, consider that, as you're traveling to Mars, after several weeks or even a month, it becomes clear that this person isn't going to get better. But, and somewhat awkwardly for ethics, nor are they dying. So, the easiest, hypothetical scenario is to say, well, this person somehow has, has gone into a persistent vegetative state. So alive, but not so alive. And, so this is the setup, right? This begs the question, what do we do with a person where we're weeks or months away from Earth and weeks or months away from one's destination, and you've got a crew member who is alive but is not going to recover in any meaningful way or on any kind of time scale that is workable for an active crew. So obviously this is a scenario where this is really not a sustainable situation, right? And in a crew where you have three people, let's say, and one of them is injured, there's probably one of the two remaining crew who is caring for that person around the clock, and then all of the rest of the duties that would normally be carried by three crewmen is really being handled by a single crew member. So again, not necessarily a sustainable scenario. And so, what I want to consider, at least super high level here is, what courses of action are available to a crew in this type of scenario. And I've suggested three. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but I think gives us some general directionality here. The first course of action is, the crew can continue to their destination, in this case, continue to Mars, all the while caring for the injured crew person, with the understanding that they will do their best, indefinitely during the voyage, and after perhaps arrival, say at Mars in this scenario. And so the obvious pros and cons is, in this scenario, you're respecting the patient. Um, by caring for them, you're preserving a duty to care for your colleague. This sense of, in the military, never leaving anyone behind. You also preserve a physician or a medic's duty, towards non-maleficence, really, having an obligation not to harm the patient in any way. But there are some significant burdens here too on both human and material resources, as I mentioned in the last slide. A second macro course of action here is that one could abort the mission and return to Earth. And if we look at it from this way, it really, very clearly, I think, puts the value of the injured crew person well above the goals of the mission, right? And above any associated costs, right? Whether those be financial costs, or the potential for study during the mission, et cetera. So again, pros, you're placing the value of the human being above the mission, above the finances, above the science. But on the downside, you are quote unquote wasting that time, that money, and likely the efforts of thousands, hundreds, if not thousands of people who did all the work to get the mission as far as it did. And if we go back to narrative ethics for a moment, there are all kinds of quotes that we can draw upon. And, in this scenario, you could imagine very easily someone saying, she's one of us, we take care of our own, we're going to do anything to save our colleague. And if that means turning the ship around, as you've heard in many movies, that's something that would be a reasonable course of action. And then lastly, there is this more tenuous option to consider, and that is to continue on, continue to one's destination. But in order to give the mission any chance for a successful outcome or simple survival of the other true crew people, that the injured person who is not getting better and will not get better, but is still very much alive and using resources on the spacecraft, both time and oxygen, et cetera, is it okay to consider euthanizing that crew member? If we look at the pros and cons here, obviously it gives the remaining crew an opportunity to move forward, an opportunity to potentially fulfill the objectives of the mission. But on the downside, it's a clear choice that there is more value on the mission and the mission's objectives than on the life of that one particular colleague. And again, if we go back to the narrative for a minute, and you actually hear this in the film that I quoted earlier, you hear this sentiment that, hey, each of us accepted the risks of this mission before signing on. We knew what we were getting into, and this wasn't a potential outcome, and I'm sure our colleague knew that too, right? And so this idea that the show must go on, let's move forward, despite the horrible scenario that a crew is put in like this. And then if we go back, just for a moment to our college university ethics course here, and think about the basic ethical principles at play, these four made, very famous, I guess you could say, or very well known by Beecham and Childress: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. I think the ones that any of them apply, by the way. I think you can make a fair case for that they all play a role in some ways, but I think the ones that really jump out are non-maleficence, this idea that we should not inflict harm on others. And in fact, if there's a medic aboard or a physician, that they have an obligation, a professional obligation likely, not to harm or inflict pain or suffering or death on one of their patients. And then also justice, right? This idea that there should be some equitable distribution of benefits and burdens, risks, costs, resources, et cetera. And so when this really comes into play nicely, I think, when you think about limited resources, on the hypothetical life raft. How do you decide who gets what, or who gets how much? And then just to continue on with your university ethics course here, we can think about some of the ethical theories at play, and two of the most, I think, well-known and most applied theories come down to utilitarianism and deontology, right? And deontology being this idea that certain acts are really always right or always wrong. And they are that sort of in and of themselves, independent of any consequences, right? And so in this case, we could look at, killing, euthanizing one's colleague as, fundamentally wrong, let's say, right? So if killing is always wrong, how do we proceed? That lies in contrast with utilitarianism, which is all about consequences, and the attempt at maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? And so if you've got a crew of three, and one is injured and incapacitated, and there are two remaining, you might make a choice that is better for the two than the one, right? Because it's creating good for the greatest number. So to wrap up here, what's my opinion on this? And I think you can make a pretty fair case for either way. Of course, nobody, and I probably should have said this at the outset, in this kind of a hypothetical situation where it to be real, no one would instinctively want to euthanize their crewmate. I think that goes without saying. But long duration human spaceflight puts the individuals involved in a very unique situation. And so I think the answer probably has to hinge on some level with the purpose of the mission and the scale of the mission, right? And again, we can look back at 100 other movies that illustrate this in different ways. But you could make the case that if the purpose of the mission was to, I'm making this up, but to travel to Mars to accomplish some task that's going to save humanity. I'm mixing up any number of movies there. You're trying to save humanity from destruction for one reason or another. Well, the value of the mission probably, very easily outweighs the life, the value of a single crew person, right? Because you've got, billions upon billions of lives that would be saved as a result. And so that utilitarianist, point of view probably works very well. But if the mission is, about pure science, or I don't know, what have you, but there isn't so much at stake, then I think that the tables are turned a little bit. And, um, if there's a mission to confirm, whether or not there is, something on Mars or not, well, that might not weigh enough in the balance of things to sacrifice one's colleague over, that piece of research, that piece of information, that thing learned. Um, so I really do think it depends on sort of the weight of the mission, right? And the purpose and the scale of what is trying to be accomplished on that mission. So again, just to wrap up, ultimately my point speaking to you today is pretty simple. That this hopefully is this kind of a scenario isn't going to happen tomorrow, because the duration our missions at this point are quite brief. But we're getting to that point when I don't think it will be all that long where longer missions will become much more commonplace. And so what I'm trying to bring to light here is the idea that we start to think about these issues now, so that we have worked through different ethical options, acceptable options when these things do happen, because I think it is a question of when and not if. So thank you for listening. I appreciate your attention, and I'll just say I'd love to continue the conversation, especially recognizing that this is a virtual presentation. So please, I'd love to get any feedback from you or questions, and certainly always open to collaboration or further discussion. And my email is there below, jstys@luc.edu. And again, I'll just say thank you, and farewell from Chicago, Illinois. And I wish the best for all the other presenters and participants. Take care.